beyond the cult of heroic martyrs. Who is remembered fondly for dying for the cause of a rebellion, like for the rejection of a particular idea or phrase in language? What popular fictional characters? How about the founding fathers of the U.S. Tea Party movement heroes like Patrick Henry, who said, "Give me liberty or give me death"? Or even the once violent Malcolm X. Malcolm X may have felt guilty about his prior advocacy of violence, so he acted to compensate for his guilt, speaking out against the advocacy of political violence, as in the phrase, "by any means necessary." And soon he was killed, and many have glorified him as a hero or martyr. So many of the heroes of our culture have been martyrs who lived and often were killed for some rebellion against some conformity. Jesus, JFK, Martin Luther King Jr., who was named after the man who inspired the first 7 letters of the word Protestant, Martin Luther, as well as more heroes of our culture who have lived for rebellion against some conformity and often were killed. Gandhi. Former terrorist leader Nelson Mandela. Of course, he's still alive, but he was in jail for 30-some years. That's close enough for present purposes. How about the protesting college student in China in Tiananmen Square who stood in the path of a tank? He was apparently arrested and was never seen again, presumably was killed. How about the Vietnamese monk who burned himself alive in protest to warfare back in the 1960s, or maybe it was 1970s? I don't know. I was not very old in the early 1970s, and so on. So lots of people who are heroic in some way are considered, maybe by a subculture, maybe not our entire culture, whatever that means. But do these heroes actually serve as models of our behavior, like what we actually do, or do they mostly just remind us of the possible consequences of nonconformity? Now, the Vietnamese monk isn't a particularly good example because he wasn't killed by somebody else, maybe, but he killed himself. That still counts as martyrdom, right? And the people who take actions that they can reasonably anticipate could or are very likely to result in them dying. That's what we mean by martyrs, people who intentionally, knowingly risk death in order to bring attention or awareness to some issue or some belief or something like that. And it could even be, like the plight of the spotted owl. It could be any issue. So, do these heroes that we may glorify, do they actually serve as models of our actual behavior? Or do they mostly just remind us of the possible consequences of nonconformity? We're glad somebody's doing something about it. I don't want to do that myself, actually, but I'm glad somebody's doing something about it, by which I mean getting killed or whatever. Drawing attention to it, resulting in getting killed. So given that virtually none of the people who glorify the heroism of Jesus follow his actual life choices to become a wandering ascetic, consider that these heroes are not so much models of behavior as reminders and warnings. We may use these martyrs to produce guilt within ourselves, with the idea being that we should not conform as we actually have been, so we're guilty. But that we should become a wandering ascetic like Jesus or the Buddha and so on. And if we don't, then we're guilty. We can have the experience of guilt for not doing what we allegedly should do according to our own cultural bias or our linguistic ideal. I should be a wandering ascetic, or I should be a spotted owl activist, or whatever it is that I might identify myself as how I should be. Of course, these identities typically are not unique to individuals. They happen in little subcultures and groups, and lots of people gather together and they agree with each other that this is how everyone should be, or whatever they agree. So focusing on whatever ideal, how we should be, how people should be, how I should be, perhaps creates and sustains the experience of tension, like physical tension, and guilt and shame, if believed. Jesus, according to popular versions of his life story, publicly rebuked the religious leaders of his day as hypocrites, apparently resulting in his death. That pattern of action is actually rather distinct from simply developing inner peace and promoting a spirit of cooperativeness. Again, not every version of his life story emphasizes all the elements equally. So it's interesting if a particular cultural tradition or religious tradition actually doesn't really emphasize the idea of inner peace and a spirit of cooperativeness and forgiveness and so forth, and instead really is just a cult of a heroic martyr. But what was he? Was he a martyr because of rebuking the people, and that's what we should do? Is we should, be like Jesus, be like Martin Luther, be like Martin Luther King, be like, Copernicus and Galileo and all the various people who have taken on the Holy Roman Empire as brave individuals. Is that what I consider my heroic ideal, or something else, or no heroic ideals in particular? Was the story of Jesus the first ever story of the rebuking of hypocrisy? Even Moses is well known for condemning the behavioral traditions of his people. Though he was not killed for it by the people he rebuked, they actually apparently followed him after he rebuked them. Further, Jesus frequently quoted the Old Testament prophet Isaiah, dramatically referencing the distinction between the activity of simply using words such as peace and respect, like in lip service, as distinct from an actual experience of peace and respect. So people could say, Lord, Lord, Jesus, I love you, I follow you, and then they could say little or nothing. They could say that or not, and then actually follow what he demonstrated. So those would be really distinct, whether they say that they're following a particular pattern of activity and what particular pattern of activity someone is following, whether or not they say anything about it. Can one be peaceful and respectful while rebuking someone? Does rebuking imply animosity and resentment and antagonism and aggressiveness? Or is it, again, possible to rebuke someone with inner peace and respect present, with dignity for the other person, we might say? Also, should people experience shame for behavior patterns that could be labeled as selfish? Should people keep certain behaviors secret, at least from inquisitors who threaten torture and execution for confessions of particular kinds of activity? Should people lie about selfish behaviors and rationalize them as having actually been unselfish? Like, well, I did it, yes, but I only did it for the following reasons, which is unselfish. So, it's a excuse, it's a extenuating circumstance, it's good intentions, and so on. So, should people always conform? Should people always condemn conformity? Should people always condemn hypocrisy? Should people discontinue the condemning of other people? Should people condemn condemnation? There's a difference, again, potentially, between rebuking hypocrisy and condemning hypocrisy. So my experience has been that I've repeatedly condemned other people, not just rebuking, but condemning other people and other patterns of activity, whether those were particular people that I knew personally or remote groups even from distant times. So I've repeatedly condemned people, a lot of them. And further, I have eventually noticed that I have sometimes done very similar things to much of what I have condemned, even after I first started condemning that thing or that pattern.
I can accept that the intensity of my condemnation of something may be proportionate to the extent of my own practice of that thing. I can also accept that the intensity of my glorifying of something may be proportionate to the extent that I avoid practicing that thing. Wouldn't it be great, this is in quotes here, right? Wouldn't it be great if people completely stopped being involved in commercial activities and just donated all their wealth and all their time to other people? That'd be so unselfish. I may say things like that, implying that such a pattern of action might be great or greater than some other pattern of action. But, like better. But I might not really know if it would be great or not because I might not have actually done it, and I may not ever. Even though I may talk a lot about how great it allegedly would be for people to stop being involved in commercial activities and donate all their wealth and all their time to other people, I might never do it. I might say, oh, that's a great idea. It's a good idea. Man, I would be a lot better off if I did it, and so would you, and I recommend it highly, and no, I don't think I'm going to try it, actually, though. Maybe next week. Maybe after I handle the following list of 73 things. Okay. What if what I really meant when I said, wouldn't it be great if people stopped being involved in commercial activities and just donated all their wealth and all their time to other people? What if I really meant this? Wouldn't it be great if everyone else except me simply donated all their wealth and time to me? I might experience that the competitiveness in the commercial economy in my midst is challenging for me. I might really like the idea of government benefits received by me that are derived from the collection activities of governments that result in me effortlessly having what used to be other people's wealth or productivity. Government mercenaries, I might say. This is a quote again. Government mercenaries, please go and find some rationalization to condemn or criminalize some behavior of other people and bring me the spoils of that conquest. And please hurry! If the spoils come from a distant nation or from traffic tickets and convictions or from confiscations from convicted local drug dealers, cool. That's fine. Just keep these roads well maintained and keep these medical services free and make these new things that I have to pay for now, make them less expensive or free. Subsidize my tax credits for new home purchases. Awesome. Who's going to pay for it? I don't know. Make somebody else pay for it. Cool. So do not betray me, government mercenaries, by leaving it to me to be responsible for my own finances, for my own welfare, for my own health, my own family, and my own experience of inner peace and respect. If people insult us and disrespect us and threaten us, government mercenaries, punish them on my behalf. If people refuse to do business with us at prices that we consider fair, conquer them. If they have values and cultures distinct from ours, like if they decline to commit to pacifism, as in us having a monopoly on nuclear weapons and they want to have some too, then give them an ultimatum between unconditional surrender and us bombing them to ashes. In a gentle, gentler way. But please do not enlist me to be directly involved in the bombing or any of that stuff, because that sounds rather dangerous. Plus, military drafts are undemocratic, and our military imperialist bombings are the most democratic in human history so far. Though we only bomb civilians when we are absolutely forced to do so by the majority voting for it, and only in order to promote and demonstrate loving kindness, peace, and the combined compassion of Christ and Buddha, and of course the inalienable right to life of all people everywhere, except of course for those who do not recognize and worship the ideal of the inalienable right to life. So you might notice there's a little bit of irony in that. Do these words sound like the jokes of Charlie Chaplin, or the ramblings of a mental patient, or the typical statements of politicians and religious leaders throughout history? How about all of the above? Remember, a martyr is someone who dies for identifying with a cause. Identifying with something involves language. Martyrs die for their language, or in some cases for failing to, confess some kind of oath, or to take some kind of oath for the lack of a particular action in language and all that goes with it. They fail to enter a contract when they could survive if they just agree to, enlist in such and such military and go kill for distant people, kill some distant people, whatever. So, this is an alternative, but just get that we're talking about dying for a linguistic ideal. Dying isn't an ideal. Linguistic ideals, like beliefs, that's one set of stuff, and then there's actually physical life and physical death. So should all people everywhere glorify the ideal of dying for a particular linguistic ideal, whatever one they choose, fine, but that you should have some linguistic ideal, and one in particular, real clear. Here's the one. That's the linguistic ideal that I glorify dying for. Someone should die for it. Lots of people. Maybe what I really mean is everyone else, but whatever. Should all people everywhere glorify the ideal of dying for a particular linguistic ideal? Well, if that appeals to you, then you can go right ahead and march on the Vatican to protest the Inquisition, or occupy Wall Street, or march on the Pentagon to protest bombs and propaganda and imperialism. By the way, consider that no one is going to march on the Pentagon because, for one thing, there's no open physical space there to make that convenient. Further, the popular conception that the U.S. is a democracy does not fit with the idea of marching on the Pentagon or onto a military base or occupying a federal courthouse. Those who believe that a particular government is a democracy are more likely to march on the great temple of the elected senators and of the lobbyists who fund them. If you think that you can go conduct a public demonstration on a military base and occupy it, or at the Pentagon and occupy that, or in a federal courthouse, or a police station, or a fire station, or the Department of Homeland Security, or an airport, simply because you live in a democracy, you may soon find that you are conducting demonstrations in a jail cell, if you were that fortunate. Democracy is a component of many political processes. So is organized coercion. That is not a contradiction. Those are just two different forms of behavior, forms of different patterns of activity. Not every government in human history has involved any democratic procedures, from the governing of a household, like where parents have authority over children, and maybe grandparents over the authority over teenagers, whatever, to an empire. Many empires have not involved any democratic procedures, or very little. Or a pirate ship, you could say. Think of a pirate ship as or any ship really. Within a ship or any military organization, there's a pretty strict hierarchy and chain of command, and people may rebel and mutiny, but that's unusual, and typically democracy just isn't involved with a squad or a battalion or a entire army. It's not a democratic process. Or if there is democracy, it's at the very top levels in a very limited way, like 3 or 4 people have, veto power, let's say. Do we all have unanimous agreement? If so, cool. If not, then it's not unanimous and we're not going to do it. That could be considered a kind of democracy, fine. But democracy varies considerably. How about organized coercion? Has any government failed to use the procedure of organized coercion ever? Like, has there ever been a government that never used organized coercion? Should we be ashamed about a particular government's use of organized coercion? Should we keep it a secret? Is there a general pattern of punishing with organized coercion those who directly reference organized coercion, like by a government? In like the mafia, if people talk openly about the activities of the mafia, of the organized coercion of the mafia, with certain other parties, that could be construed as a betrayal, and it could be punished very severely. So there are some instances in which speaking of organized coercion any details about it, dates and times and places and people and so on, that could be severely discouraged. But in contrast to that kind of thing, in the case of formal governments that have taken steps to legitimize themselves, they're very big bureaucracies. They're very open in terms of calling themselves a government, and very open in the sense that they publicly threaten and perform acts of organized coercion. In that case, is there only a specific pattern of punishing those, like governments punishing those people who directly antagonize the agents of organized coercion? The people who threaten them, who antagonize them, who go into court with contempt. So that brings up the idea of contemptuousness. And is there contempt present? That's distinct from rebuking. That gets back to more like condemnation. So those who are raging with contempt may be targets of organized coercion and punishment by governments. And as well, governments might punish people for simply making reference to specific times and dates and places and so forth. Certainly if someone's in the military and they specify certain details, especially in advance of a action that's planned, that would not be considered favorable. That would be strongly discouraged. That would be considered treason, potentially punishable by death. Like you don't get a second, you don't get a second chance if you give away the locations of an ambush or something that your squad's about to do. If that's found out, your squad might be upset and take actions to prevent to discourage anybody, to make an example of somebody who divulges that kind of private or secret information. So is there a specific pattern of punishing those who directly antagonize the agents of organized coercion? Only those, in the U.S. at least, it seems most often that the punishments, like jailing someone and arresting them and all that stuff, for exercising their rights to freedom of speech, that tends to happen when people are directly antagonizing the agents of organized coercion or certain powers that be. They're close enough to, that are in control and in cahoots with the agents of organized coercion. In other words, the people who run the government. So wouldn't you be wary of populist campaigns to occupy the Pentagon, or even to occupy an airport in China? Your coercion is probably not even close to organized enough to successfully accomplish that kind of result. You and I don't, we presume, have the organized coercion capacities to actually occupy the Pentagon. Be realistic. In other words, if you like, for an interesting afternoon, go ahead and gather up a few thousand friends to occupy Wall Street. Further, if being a martyr especially appeals to your pride, then identify some linguistic ideal and commit to dying for it. Actually dying. If your idealistic sacrifice, if you actually die, and if it attracts enough publicity, then you may even be remembered fondly as one of a rather long list of trailblazers in the promoting of other people's right to make themselves into martyrs too. Of course, such a path of drama, pride, and possible fame may not be the path of inner peace. If inner peace appeals to you, then dying for a linguistic ideal may not be of any relevance to you. You may find it more inspiring to question the nature of all linguistic ideals, including the ideal of the heroic martyr. Assalamu alaikum. Alaikum shalom.